Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today I'm super stoked to chat with the hypertrophy specialist himself, Brad Shoenfeld. Brad is a PhD and he was a 2011 NSCA Personal Trainer of the Year, among many other things. So he's an absolute wealth of knowledge. Brad, thanks for joining me, man.
My pleasure.
So the thing I like most about you and your approach is that you've got this lethal combination of a ton of experience on the research side of things, but also as well as the practical implementation with clients in the trenches, so to speak. So before we dig into all things muscle growth, can you give folks a bit of background on yourself and how you got into the fitness game?
Yeah, sure. My interest at the beginning was purely from personal training standpoint. I started out as a bodybuilder, as a skinny kid, and I got into bodybuilding, and that led me to want to be a trainer to impart the knowledge that I had gained in the trenches of training myself to others. And we don't have enough time to get into the specifics, but I started to really get into the science aspect of it. And the more I did, first of all, it was mostly for myself at the beginning, getting into the scientific aspect, to enhance my continued progress. I started plateauing with the training that I'd been doing. Anyway, and as I got more and more into the training aspect of training other people, I wanted to be able to impart scientific knowledge. And I started realizing about midway through that there just wasn't all that much research on hypertrophy. Hypertrophy kind of was always the bastard child of the strength and conditioning field. Basically, it was obviously strength and conditioning coaches are concerned with athletic performance, generally not bodybuilding, and their focus was on performance aspects, and that was strength and power. Hypertrophy, the only reason it was even studied was to their enhancements through strength and power. So it was always kind of a sidelight, often not even reported in a lot of studies. And I started realizing about most of the hypertrophy recommendations were based on very shaky basic science. It was extrapolations from basic science. And long story short, I decided to move my career into academia, got my PhD. And basically, I think I would say that my research has resonated so much is because I'm like a kid in a candy store. I'm studying everything that I wanted to know about when I was a personal trainer. And other people in the fitness field obviously feel the same way. And look, I'll kind of leave it with this. When I was a trainer, not, let's say, taking outside some of the athletes that I trained, but the majority, certainly the general public, I don't think I ever got a general public client coming in saying, I want to increase my vertical jump by an inch, or I want to enhance my VO2 by, a few milliliters. So basically, they would say, I want to look great naked. I want to increase my muscle growth. I want to decrease body fat. And as a bodybuilder, that always resonated with me. And I think that's resonated now in the research that I've carried out, and that's spurred a lot of other research in the area as well.
Yeah, I think general pop folks, that's the interest, right? They want to look good naked, look good at the beach, and you actually started your website. The name of it is Look Great Naked, right? Or Look Good Naked.
Look Great Naked, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so you've stated that folks can get about 70 to 75% of their attainable hypertrophy progress by basically training hard, showing up consistently, and eating right. So I love this approach because not everybody wants to live in the gym, me included, and there's a point of diminishing returns from a time, effort, and result standpoint. So when you say training hard, how would you explain that to folks, and how could or should they assess their training to be sure that they're either training hard enough but also not too hard?
So I'll answer that question. I first do want to say, when you throw out numbers, or when I do, like 75%, those are just very general estimations. Like for everyone, it's different. Some people, they'll gain most of their, that would account for 90% of their development, where others it would be less. So it's kind of on a basic average.
Totally.
But as far as it's not like everyone gets 75%.
Yeah.
These are the types of I want to make sure that my vision is accurately conveyed. When I talk about training hard, it's basically pushing your body beyond its present capacity. So now, if you do a ridiculous routine, obviously there's always, I'm talking in general, where someone's going to use a basic, decent basic routine that's moderate volume. But even with that, I mean, so I've often talked about like volume is a primary driver of hypertrophy. With a HIIT routine, you can get a good percentage of your growth. The majority of people can get a good percentage of their ultimate growth. So really, those are the nuances. If you train hard, meaning that you push your body beyond its present capacity, you do a well-rounded routine as far as the types of exercises you're doing, working the major muscle groups. You hit it with a sufficient frequency, and what is that? I mean, 2 to 3 days a week even. You're going to get a large percentage, a majority of your gains, I would say, just through that. And of course, then the nutritional aspect comes in, particularly protein, consuming adequate protein intake. The rest, to optimize your genetic potential, that's where the scientific aspects come in and can become extremely important depending on your genetics.
Right. And double clicking on some of those aspects from a volume standpoint, is there sort of a rough estimate where you would start somebody, like how many sets they would aim for over the course of the week for each body part? Or how do you recommend folks sort of just get started?
You know, volume is something, when you talk about volume, my general philosophy is that you don't want to have too high volumes for too long a period of time, but the body is very resilient. So for short periods, you can push yourself beyond what most people think they can and actually achieve good gains out of it for most people. I wouldn't recommend doing that for long periods of time, because that then devolves into overtraining. So where you'd start someone, it's not a static, at least the way I approach it, is not a static number. And I think that, to me, is one of the issues that I'd have with some of the recommendations that I see out there. They talk about, not just for volume, but just for training in general, they talk about it on a very static basis, where, to me, if you're really looking to maximize your genetics, you need to consider training blocks, what you're going to accomplish, have deload periods, and look at it again more from a strategic scientific standpoint. Now, that's getting someone from 90% to 100%, or I guess you never get to 100%, but let's say somewhere 80 to 90% up to close to their genetic potential. If you're asking me where general regards to where I start, somewhere around 3 sets per exercise, 3 sets per exercise, maybe 10 sets per muscle group per week or so is kind of a general baseline. And then for me, at least, I try to grade that over time to push someone up to see. A colleague of mine, Mike Israetel, was, in my opinion, a really excellent practitioner, a scientific practitioner, has coined the term maximal recoverable volume. You might have heard that. And I think the basis of that is very intuitive and very, it really hits home in the sense that it says, or the theory behind it is that everyone has different levels of recovery from volume. And to me, that's where you want to apportion that over time.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And taking someone's MRV into account, there's just a point where it doesn't matter how much you're sleeping, eating, you could be doing everything right, but there's an amount of volume that you just cannot recover from.
And by the way, that's individual, based on individual genetics. Other things when we're talking about volume that I think a lot of times does not get the play that it should. You need to take into account the type of exercise. Is it multi-joint free weight versus single joint machine? I never heard anyone saying, "Man, I really got slammed from doing 6 sets of leg extensions." Where squats is something that it's harder to recover from. It's going to take more out of you. Your age is going to have a big effect. Virtually all the studies that I carry out are in young resistance-trained males that are average age 21 years. When you're dealing with an older guy like me, I'm not recovering the way they are. And people older than me certainly are recovering even more poorly. So that needs to be taken into account. You're not going to be able to push the volume that you will for someone who's 20 as you would someone who's 30, 40, 50, as a general rule. So again, it really, there are nuances, a lot of nuances that are, in my opinion, quite important that need to be considered. It's not just this is where when we talk about these things, it's not cookie cutter. Everyone wants that, hey, do this many sets, this many reps, and kind of have this cookie cutter program. You don't spit out computerized programs to optimize individual responses.
Right, and I know that Eric Helms sort of gives out that 10 set recommendation as just a starting point. Okay, let's test the waters. Let's get 10 sets in. Hey, you can't recover from that, scale down, or it's not enough and scale up.
Yeah, Eric is a colleague of mine, a friend and a colleague, and my general theories on training intersect quite well with Eric's. And Mike Israel tells it that there are certain, I think, nuances between all of us in terms of how we interpret literature, and also based on our personal experiences in dealing with individuals. But I think overall, we find 95% agreement between me and Eric, and me and Mike, and some of the other people in the field.
Totally. Now, given that 10 sets, building a little further off that, assuming that volume is equated for, does it matter a ton if somebody uses something like a full body approach or an upper lower setup or a bro split where they do all 10 sets in one session?
So interestingly, a colleague of mine, James Krieger, who's another really astute fitness professional and someone that I've collaborated on in a lot of my studies, and he's really a statistical whiz. He's done some simulations, and I think one of the other things to consider with volume is how many sets per muscle per session that you're dealing with. And yeah, I do think that there is a limit to what your protein synthetic capacity is within a given, if you do 20, 30 sets, like some bro splits do, of, let's say, chest, of your pecs, there's going to be a diminishing return standpoint. And my colleague James has done some simulations that seem to show somewhere around 8 to 10 sets per muscle per session is kind of that tap out limit. So let's say you want to do 20 sets in a week, splitting it out over at least 10 sets in 2 sessions would be preferable, or perhaps 7 sets over 3 sessions, that type of thing.
Right, yeah, and folks will be familiar with James as well as Eric because they've both been on the podcast and chatted about some different stuff. Brad, from an exercise selection standpoint, are there certain movements that you like folks to center their training around, or how do you recommend that people approach exercise selection from like a best bang for your buck efficiency angle?
So that's a great question, and again, a very nuanced topic. So my general approach here is and we're talking now hypertrophy, right? You're talking about maximizing, like from a bodybuilding standpoint, because the specific individual is going to give different answers based on that. I mean, if it's your average stockbroker who's not concerned about maximizing complete symmetry of muscles, there would be a somewhat different approach. You can have a much better bang for your buck and not worry about looking at rear delt versus front delt, the size differences, or calves versus biceps and that type of thing. So I'll approach it from a bodybuilding standpoint where you're looking for optimal symmetry. And one of my things over the years has been, not only did I compete as a somewhat low-level bodybuilder, but I've worked with many high-level bodybuilders, professionals and very high-level competitors in NPC and WMBF and other organizations. And the goal there is complete maximum muscle symmetry. And my general philosophy is to work the muscle from different angles and different planes, taking into account, nuances like, I think this is going way too far for a talk like this because it would be the topic of an entire podcast. But as a matter of fact, I do seminars. Specifically, I'm doing a seminar coming up in Portugal where I'm going to do a 4-hour practical just on exercise selection and how to approach it. But things like passive tension, active insufficiency. So active insufficiency is where it's a two joint muscle that's made shortened at one end or lengthened at one end and then is acted upon at the other. That's going to affect how the muscle is developed. I'll give you a for instance there. Let's say we're talking about the calf muscles. If you do a seated calf raise, the gastrocnemius is a knee flexor as well as a plantar flexor, so a calf extensor. ankle extensor. When you do a seated calf raise, the gastroc becomes somewhat slackened and thus cannot produce as much force, meaning that the soleus has to take over a greater share of the load. Whereas if you do a standing calf raise, you lengthen the gastrocnemius at the knee joint. Thus, when you act upon it at the ankle joint in the plantar flexion in a calf raise, it's going to have greater efficiency and effectiveness, and thus have greater stimulation. So by utilizing both of them, you can target the soleus and gastroc to greater extents.
Okay, gotcha. And then,
And there's many other techniques that we can talk about, looking at planes of movement. I mean, the shoulder joint in your sagittal plane, you're getting your frontal delt. In your frontal plane, you're getting your middle delt. And then your horizontal plane, your transverse plane, you're getting your posterior delt. So looking at it from a planar standpoint, looking at it from compound versus single joint movements, looking at it from accentuated activation, so different body positions in space. So if you do for instance, a good morning, that's going to affect the glute, the curve, the strength curve of the glutes differently than if you did let's say a cable kickback for the glute. These are all things that can and should be taken into account if you want to optimize muscle growth. If you're just, again, a stockbroker who wants to get bigger, doing your basic lifts is going to be fine. So this is where when people say, some people say, oh, I don't need to do all that. Well, again, my answer would be it depends. Depends on who you are and what your goals are.
yeah, and I'm not sure if you caught it, but Mike Isertel and Nick Tomanello just had an awesome podcast on, range of motion on the Revive Stronger podcast, chatting about, for example, a squat. Like the squat is limited, your load of the squat is limited by, assuming that you're going at least to parallel, by how strong you are at the weakest or the most difficult part of that movement, versus it's not that overloading once you get to, say, 3/4, because it's just a much more mechanical advantage of a position than the bottom of the squat.
I didn't see the podcast, but I would say that's another thing that needs to be taken into account from a range of motion standpoint is where the stretch position is, because it's been shown that in the stretch position you're getting generally speaking, greater hypertrophic stimulation than in the somewhat shortened position. So in the squat, it's been shown fairly readily that the quads get greater development in the deep position than they do in the even when load is equated, when you're doing, let's say, heavier loads for the shortened position. The same with a leg extension, the bottom position so when you're going from 90 degrees or so 100 degrees to 50 degrees, you get greater hypertrophy in the quads because it's in the lengthened position than you do going from 40 to 0 degrees. And that doesn't mean that all positions aren't important, but does give you some insights that perhaps working muscles in their lengthened position, again, is a technique that I've used to accentuate hypertrophic adaptations.
Gotcha. Now, moving on to the nutritional aspect a little bit, you touched on this as far as, making sure that when it comes to hypertrophy, protein and then total calories are accounted for. Do you, depending on the person, obviously, there's nuance like we've touched on, but do you have some folks that eat a higher carbohydrate diet, or you have them eat a higher fat approach, or you take a middle of the road approach? Do you think that there's an advantage when it comes to hypertrophy as far as a more favorable macronutrient ratio once the protein and the calories are squared away?
Not really. So I think when you're talking about carbohydrate, I think a basic level of carbohydrates are needed, but going higher than that is not. Where that is somewhat dependent on the person's size, etc. But we're talking a few hundred grams or 200 grams or so of carbs, or within that range. I think where the carbohydrate fat ratios can be somewhat more important as far as getting someone shredded. I have found pretty consistently, and this you can't really tell from the literature, because no literature is looking at bodybuilders getting shredded in a controlled fashion. They're looking at your average Joe losing weight, and that's a different game. But different different clients that I've worked with have responded better to somewhat higher or somewhat lower carbohydrate intakes for losing body fat. As far as hypertrophy goes, I do not believe a ketogenic diet is favorable to hypertrophy. I think it can be fine for losing fat and even losing fat while maintaining muscle, but for building muscle, there are just several reasons, and getting things like the AMPK, glycogen is an energy sensor, and that it does, although have been at least one study that recently came out, fairly recently, that showed that glycogen depletion did not negatively affect intracellular signaling. Now, there's others that have shown that. But I do think just from a theoretical standpoint and the limited research that we have on it from a bodybuilding standpoint, it's not an ideal. You can certainly build muscle. I'm not saying you can't build muscle on a ketogenic diet. You can. That's people that say otherwise are just not paying attention. But whether you can maximize muscle, I would say the limited evidence we have, and certainly the theoretical evidence that we have based upon how the body responds to depletion of carbohydrates, would suggest that you need a certain minimum amount, minimum threshold. And once that's met, I don't necessarily feel that adding higher carbohydrate intakes has beneficial effects over adding higher fat intakes. Increasing protein beyond a certain point is not generally a great strategy because you're going to oxidize a lot of the amino acids. It's just not going to be used. You want more energy when you want to be in a surplus to create more energy, and that generally is better done through fat and carbohydrate once you've hit your minimum threshold for protein intake.
And touching on protein, do you have a minimum amount of meals or protein feedings throughout the day that you have folks hit or like to hit, or do you work more so with their schedule, like if somebody wants to eat 2 meals a day versus 4 meals, or what does the research say about protein synthesis and protein timing around hypertrophic response?
Yeah, so there's limited, we'd like to think that all these things are so well studied, and they aren't. There is limited data on this. The data that we have is confounded. So what you have to realize, like, to get more control, which is always a good thing for research, because if you control everything except your treatment variable, you can draw causality to a greater extent. I'll give you a frame, but that can be problematic. So let's say with protein, spreading out protein feedings, one of the big studies that's always cited is a study by Arita. It was out of Stu Phillips' lab, excellent researcher, and it was an interesting study which showed that 4 feedings a day was better than 2 or 8. Here's the kicker. There's a couple. Number one, they only fed an 80-gram bolus of protein, so it was 2 40-gram boluses, 4 20-gram, or 8 10-gram boluses. Well, number one, and these were to males, to resistance-trained males. We know that 80 grams over the course of a day is insufficient to optimize protein synthesis. It's just not, the amount of protein isn't sufficient. Number two, it was just feeding a protein bolus. They didn't have any other foods, which is important to gain control, but that's just not ecologically valid. Who just has protein, spread out? You're going to be eating other nutrients, and that's going to have differential effects on absorption. And it was a whey protein, which is oxidized very rapidly. So does that have practical applications to, let's say, chicken and rice? Probably not. Certainly, I can make a good case there that it wouldn't necessarily, the digestive aspects would be vastly different, and it might affect the how your protein synthetic response is meted out over the course of the day. So what I would say, this is in my humble opinion and based on theory as well as anecdotal evidence, is that spreading out the meals over 3 to 4 meals a day would be generally best for maximizing anabolism. Like ideally around 4 would be a good strategy every 4 hours or so. And that's, why am I saying that? It's based on mostly theoretical evidence based upon what we know, in that the average anabolic effects of a meal last around 4 to 5 hours. So you want to eat, if the anabolic effects of a meal have now ebbed, you want to then get your body back into anabolism rather than having catabolic periods. The more you can keep your body anabolic, at least theoretically, the greater the chance that you'll build more muscle. Now, is this going to have huge effects? Again, for your average Joe or Jane, they're fine on an intermittent fasting protocol. For a bodybuilder, I would not recommend intermittent fasting during their hypertrophy phase. They're trying to grow. Now, if you're asking about reducing body fat, intermittent fasting can be a very viable strategy. And so if you're looking to maintain muscle, again, it comes down to the individual.
And as far as general body fat percentage for a man and a woman, is there a range that you like to have people stay within, as far as not getting too low, but then obviously not getting too high? I think Mike Israetel has thrown out like 20% is sort of a general top end range, and then as far as being too lean, that seems to really, really vary between individuals, getting on the lower end more so than the top end. But where do you like folks to sit?
Yeah, so what you have to remember is that if you're going to be really lean, you're not going to be in a caloric surplus to maintain a really lean body. So to maximize muscle growth, you generally need to be in a caloric surplus. Generally, you do need to be in a caloric surplus. Now, it doesn't have to be a large surplus, but you're not going to be able to maintain, you're not going to be shredded and be in a surplus over a period of time. When you start increasing your calories above maintenance, it's going to cause you to gain body fat. I agree with Mike. I don't know if you're talking a bodybuilder. I certainly don't believe in the Lee Priest super diet where you just you balloon up, you gain 90 plus pounds of fat and then shred down, and also you gain muscle. I don't think that's a viable strategy, because I don't think you gain. There's no evidence that you gain more muscle by having massive overfeeding in that respect. So yeah, I like that more of, I guess you'd call it a clean bulk, and staying somewhere within around at the 20%, maybe going a little higher, 25% top end, never going above that body fat wise. Somewhat depends on the person. And can they do it somewhat lower? Yeah, I think probably in a 15 to 25% range would be, for most people, where you'd want to be for building muscle.
Gotcha. And then as far as your personal work with the Devils, how much do you find that it varies between individuals as far as their spot body fat wise for optimal performance? So some guys maybe like to stay a little leaner or just naturally stay leaner and perform quite well, versus some guys sit a little bit higher on the body fat scale but perform better at that spot. So how do you coach guys through that?
It's a very interesting question. Number one, the players are all at fairly lean body fat levels. I think the highest body fat on the team is somewhere around 13%. So we're talking, and the lowest is around 7. So we're not talking, no one is sitting at like the 20% level. It's not like baseball where you can get like a pitcher and, or a, let's say, DH who's going to be at fairly high levels, or even like football, where I think would be an even better example, where you'd have certain like linemen or whatever that have large variations in body fat. So in hockey, it's somewhat different. When I coach them so most of my work with the Devils is on a team basis. I'm giving lectures on how to perform. So when they come to me with they need to come to me individually. I don't work, like not every player gets individual attention because they don't ask for it. It only is the individual is when they ask for it. And really that's like anything else, that comes down to individual, to talking, finding out what their needs are, and what they feel best. To me, there is no optimal body fat level for sports performance. It's what the person, within reason. Now, you're not going to be a sumo wrestler and be skating and be a forward. But within, somewhat wide spectrums, like I said, 7 to 13%. I could even see them going 15%. Someone might be comfortable at that range. Maybe not, but that's where you got to play around with it. And ultimately, it comes down to the individual and making sure that that whatever they're going, if they're telling me that they're drained, that they're crashing on the ice, when I say crashing, that by the end of their shift, they're not able to complete their shift. I'm not necessarily looking at body fat. I'm looking at, are they properly carved up? Are they getting enough intra-game carbohydrate? Are they hydrating properly before their training? So a lot of it goes beyond the body comp standpoint and goes more towards performance aspects of nutrition. You know, sports performance is a different ball game than it is, no pun intended, but a different animal than body composition is. They are related. Certainly, if someone has high body fat levels, that can have effects. But you wouldn't necessarily assume if someone isn't, you know, let's say they're not able to, or at the end of their shifts, they're starting to drag, it isn't necessarily due to body composition factors. It could be due to other factors of their nutrition. Or
Right.
sleep. Could be other things as well. Could be outside of nutritional realms. But if it's nutrition, it doesn't necessarily have to be body comp. And that, while we in bodybuilding circles often think about that's our sole focus, sports performance takes many other factors into account nutritionally.
Right. Now, knowing as much as you know, I think it'll be super helpful for folks to get some insight into what your current goals are and how your training looks and how you're structuring it right now as far as your own sort of pursuits.
My goals at this point are maintenance. I have so much going on that I'm at least at this point, my competitive days are over. I keep a good body fat. My body fat, certainly for years, probably 15 plus years, I was 7%. I was shredded. I had an 8-pack, 365 days a year. But I was so anal with my diet, and I just don't want to do that anymore. It's just not my thing. And I like actually being somewhat heavier. So, I'm probably now in the 12 to 14% body fat realm, depending upon what's going on at the time. My training, I try to train as often as possible. So I do an upper-lower split. And my goal is to get 6 days a week in. I rarely do that. My schedule doesn't allow it. So I will often, I'd say most often, get 4 days a week in. Some days when I travel, like a week that I travel, I might get 2 days in. And then sometimes I do get 6. So I just try to hit my upper and lower body. So I have to get my whole body at least once a week. I don't think I've missed doing that in 30 years. But other than that, I just try to, I vary my exercises. I vary my rep ranges to a certain extent, somewhere between. I don't go really heavy anymore. I never go for singles or even triples. Probably the heaviest I go is 5 to 6 reps would be kind of my minimum threshold, and I go up to around 20 or so. So I try to keep a spectrum of rep ranges over time, and that usually I structure that with my compound-based movements in the somewhat lower realm, 5 to 10, and then often my single joint will, when I do the higher reps, they'll be in, let's say, leg extensions or flies or lateral raises, exercises that have less joint stresses and that are more focused, more targeted. And I incorporate drop sets and techniques like that. And ultimately, it's mostly now for maintenance. If I can eke out an extra, look, I've been training 30 years. So my large portion of my genetic, I don't think anyone ever hits, one of the things they talk about is genetic ceiling. I don't think anyone ever hits a genetic ceiling. And I know that if I really applied myself and I put my own knowledge to what I do with others into effect, that I can gain more muscle. It might be, a few pounds a year, 2, 3, 4 pounds a year would be kind of my upper limit. And that would have to do with really focus my training, structuring it more in a more regimented fashion and having more structured nutritional patterns. It's just not in my cards at this point. I have so many things that it's your priorities take over.
Totally. And then how about nutrition-wise? How do you balance your nutrition with your training, and then obviously taking into account your schedule and you're on the road all the time? So what do you focus on nutritionally?
So when I'm home, my eating is generally very regimented and quite good. I have pretty much the same things to eat on a daily basis, but then I'll go out probably a couple times a week to restaurants, or parties or whatever, and whatever, I don't even worry about what I'm going to have. Where I used to be when I told you I had my 8-pack year round, I'd eat before I went, and I wouldn't eat. Or I would go to a restaurant and I'd say I want to have grilled chicken, broccoli, and dressing is on the side, etc. And then when I go away, it's poker. Basically, I like to experience different cultures, and I travel quite often now. I'm away at least once or twice a month, or at least once, and sometimes twice, and even 3 times a month, often in foreign countries. And I like to experience the food cultures of other countries. And I mean, I generally gained several pounds when I'm coming home from trip.
Right. And then as far as where you were for a long time at, at 7% to where you are now, I guess it's tough to equate because you're probably at a different age than you were when you were maintaining that. But as far as how you feel, what is the biggest difference between being like maintaining that really low body fat percentage and where you kind of are now as far as general, just like sense of well-being? Because when you're that lean, like, man, you kind of feel like shit sometimes.
It's real interesting. Now, I did get down when I was competing. It was measured by Schoenfeld, so I will give that as the caveat. I'm not sure how accurate, but I think I was legit 5%. Then I got really lean. But when I was, in the 7% range all the time, I felt fine. At the beginning, when I started doing it, here's what I think, and this is purely hypothesis of mine, and it's the literature somewhat does bear this out, but there is something called a body weight set point that everyone wants to have, and my set point as well. I generally am lean, so I never have had trouble getting lean. I'm an ectomorph. My trouble was to add a lot of mass. But the set point theory says that when you start getting lower and lower to a certain point below your set point, that basically two factors happen. Your body starts to slow its metabolic rate down, and it increases hunger. I did experience that in the initial phases, but over time, after 6 months or so, maybe a little more, of doing it consistently. So at the beginning, it was somewhat hard. Once I passed that 6 month or so standpoint, I didn't even think it just became part of my life. The way eating was a necessary aspect of survival, basically. And I didn't think about food in a, like I do now. Now I enjoy, so when you're asking me the differences, I enjoy eating now, which is cool. It's just I think my life is richer because of it. I might not be able to, pull up my shirt in the mirror, but it's just not my thing anymore. It's just a different point in my life from when I was a bodybuilder and what my priorities were. But I will tell you that I think that if within reason, within a certain level of your set point, maintaining low body fats can be done, and I think the negative consequences begin to dissipate. I think the body, if you want to, I'll give you my own hypothesis on it, that of course it's a survival mechanism. Your set point is a survival mechanism going back to prehistoric times. And my theory or my hypothesis is that when you maintain low body fat levels for extended periods of time, the body basically starts to default and say, hey, I guess the famine isn't so bad that we're not going to, we'll still survive. And it kind of gives up on really making you much hungry. And I did not experience huge hunger cravings. I could walk past the bakery with cheesecake, which is like my favorite treat food, and it wouldn't faze me. So that's just personal experience. Maybe, I know other people, certainly other people have different experiences, but most people don't maintain this over long periods of time. I was just so focused. I came from a disordered body image standpoint where I just was really dissatisfied with my physique when I was younger, and that's what got me into bodybuilding. I think a lot of bodybuilders are that way. But with me, it was so prevalent, so persistent that it just really altered my thinking as to how I wanted to. Once I got shredded, and once I got a good amount of muscle, I increased my muscle mass probably 20 pounds, certainly 15 or so pounds in the first year. And I was really shredded. It changed my life. So I wanted to be that way all the time. Now it's just different in terms of my priorities and what I know, and just confidence in my self-confidence, and who I am at this point too enters into it. So I'm happy with with how that's transposed over time.
Now, I want to be respectful of your time. So as we start to wrap up here, if folks want to learn more about you, your books, research, all the amazing work that you've got going on, where can they find you?
I mean, I'm on all the social media platforms. I've kind of been doing more on Instagram lately, but I mean, I'm on Facebook, Twitter. I share a lot of my research stuff and other research stuff on Twitter, on my research platform, in different ways. I use the social media platform somewhat differently, so they can follow me there. And I have a website, lookgreatnaked.com, where I hopefully will post another blog post soon, but I've been fairly delinquent in that. And my books are available on Amazon.com. You Google me and you'll get all the info you want.
Your Instagram is great. I love it. There was an infographic you put out comparing, a complete amino acid situation with like whey protein, I believe, versus BCAAs. Can you just quickly touch on that? Because BCAAs are, a lot of people are still taking them and not realizing that they may not be getting the full benefit out of those versus a whole whey protein supplement.
Sure. So for those who don't know, branched chain amino acids, BCAAs, are 3 amino acids: leucine, isoleucine, and valine. There's been, for years, they've been promoted as a anabolic supplement, particularly to not only enhance anabolism, but to prevent catabolism post-workout. And so when you look at, this is why you have to look at studies, not just read abstracts. When you look at studies, if under protein-deprived conditions, so when people have suboptimal protein intakes, if you supplement with BCAAs, it can have an anabolic response. When you compare whey protein, let's say both two people that have suboptimal protein intakes, you give one whey protein, you give the other BCAAs, the whey protein has a greater anabolic effect. Why? Because whey protein has all the essential amino acids. So the BCAAs are essential amino acids, but there are 9 essential amino acids. So BCAAs don't have 6 of those. You need all the essential amino acids to build muscle. And bottom line is that BCAAs really are a waste of money. They're actually more expensive on a per serving basis than whey is, and you get more bang for your buck with the whey from an anabolic standpoint. And neither one, by the way, I should say, if you are consuming adequate protein from whole foods, supplementing with whey, supplementing with any other protein sources are going to get you any more muscle. So if you're hitting your targets with whole foods, say 1.7 grams, 1.6, 1.7 to 2.0, I would say is kind of usually my default position to capture all bases, if you will. Taking additional protein in any form or amino acids won't do diddly.
Yeah, that's a great take-home point. And I'll link to all your stuff in the show notes below, man. And Brad, I just want to thank you for taking the time to chat with us. I really appreciate it, man.
My pleasure, man.
Awesome. I'll catch you guys on the next episode.